Welcome to today's AIPH Green City Briefing, promoting biodiversity across the city. I'm Audrey Tim, and I lead the Green City Initiative team here at AIPH. We use knowledge exchange, advocacy, and networking to change the way the world thinks about urban greening. To start with today, I'll explain to you how the webinar is going to run. First, I'll introduce the MC. This will be followed by our first speaker, then our second speaker, before moving to a discussion section. This will be your opportunity to ask questions and contribute to the discussion. As the presentations progress, please put your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. AIPH is very grateful to the Worshipful Company of Gardeners for their continued support of the AIPH Green City Briefings program. This is our third series of briefings made possible by this very important partnership, and today's session has particular relevance. As many of you already know, AIPH captures the latest Green City news, projects, research, and initiatives from around the world in our monthly AIPH Green City Global Update. Sign up today via the link in the chat. To start the session, please may I introduce you to the MC for today, Cindy Leslie, Master Gardener of the Worshipful Company of Gardeners for 2025. Cindy has had a distinguished career as a solicitor in the City of London, specialising in commercial dispute resolution. She also has wide non-executive experience. She is currently on a number of boards, including Birkbeck University, University of London, the Architects Registration Board, the Architects Regulator, Ofqual, the Exams and Qualifications Regulator, and the Royal College of Psychiatrists and Perennial. She also undertakes fitness to practice work. Cindy, over to you. Thank you for leading the session today.
Hello, everyone. And again, welcome to this AIPH Green City Briefing. My name is Cindy Leslie, and I have the honour of being the Master of the Worshipful Company of Gardeners. The company is one of 111 livery companies in the City of London. There's a huge range of crafts and skills that the different livery companies promote, whether gardeners, goldsmiths, farmers, fruiterers, haberdashers, and a large number of new companies such as the information technologists, architects, and recently nurses. The Worshipful Company of Gardeners has been in existence as a livery company in the City of London for hundreds of years, and all that time it's promoted horticulture. Initially, the company focused almost entirely on the growing and selling of flowers, fruit and vegetables. But now the company promotes horticulture in all its various forms, whether garden design, arboriculture, turf maintenance, biodiversity, and much more. Right from the beginning, the education of gardeners and other horticulturalists has been central to the company's purpose. I joined the company by apprenticeship many years ago, and I'm just going to stress that many years ago bit. In those days, apprenticeship was called servitude. My indentures of servitude were in the 17th century form, and they required my master to train me in the craft and mystery of gardening. My master was required to provide me with board and lodging, but he could not give me salmon more than 4 times a week. Gone are the days when salmon was plentiful in the River Thames here, so the apprentice boys were obviously sick of salmon morning, noon and night. My indentures also provided that there was to be no marriage and no fornication without my master's consent. You will not be surprised to hear that the livery company apprenticeship form has now been totally rewritten. In recent times, there's been much greater appreciation of the value of horticulture in responding to the challenges of climate change and the loss of biodiversity, as well as in the help that horticulture can bring in addressing physical disability and promoting mental well-being. The company has worked hard to develop and publicise how horticulture can help in all of these areas, and this is why we're sponsoring today's briefing. Although today, as your Master of Ceremonies, I'm wearing my Worshipful Company of Gardeners hat, or rather my badge, I wanted to mention another very important role that I hold, and that's as trustee of a UK charity called Perennial. Perennial's mission is to help to build better lives for all those within the horticultural sector. We do this by supporting horticulturalists when a crisis has hit them, but perhaps even more importantly, by helping them to avoid a crisis. We provide free, tailored, one-to-one confidential support when needed. We also provide access to free advice and information 24/7 online. The sort of problems that Perennial helps with include the impact of health issues, bereavement, redundancy, family breakdowns, career progression issues, that sort of thing. We also provide impartial money management and health and well-being tools, and we have a regulated debt advice service. One of the challenges that Perennial faces is that there's no one place where we can find and tell horticulturalists that we're there for them. The horticultural colleges tell students about us, but any memory of them may well have faded long before help is needed. So I do hope, therefore, that you will spread the word that Perennial is there for horticulturalists here. I also hope that in your various jurisdictions there's the equivalent of Perennial, or that you will consider setting up something along the same lines. So now we're going to start the presentations, and the first one is going to come from Dr. Stephanie Bird, whose topic is picking plants for pollinators, how to choose what to grow. So I think I'm going to be really fascinated to hear about that. So I'm just going to say a word about Dr. Stephanie Bird. She's a senior entomologist at the RHS with a background in botany and ecology. Her PhD work complemented the Plants for Bugs project, which explored the impact of vegetation origin on garden biodiversity. While at the RHS, she's conducted research into what plants people are already growing for UK pollinating insects. She's co-supervised a PhD student studying the floral resources and insect pollinator pollinations in urban landscapes. And she's currently reviewing the RHS Plants for Pollinators Garden Plants list. She's planning further research into plants that could be actually included in that list going forward. Steph is keen to help gardeners and planners find ways to encourage wildlife, particularly invertebrates, into their green spaces, and she's a keen allotment holder and gardener, as well as a trustee of the Wildlife Gardening Forum and a member of the government's Pollinator Advisory Steering Group. So over to you, Steph.
Right, thank you. Just share that. So, hi, I'm Steph. I am an entomologist at the Royal Horticultural Society. So, the RHS is a UK gardening charity. We have roughly 625,000 members at the moment, and each of our members is entitled to ask us for advice. So as an RHS entomologist, I answer these generally identification inquiries, but I also conduct research into the areas of interest for our membership. So increasingly, this for me covers garden plants for pollinating insects. Right. So today I'll talk to you about how we make decisions regarding what plants we recommend for pollinating insects. And I'll cover some of the aspects that need to be taken into consideration when picking plants for pollinators. So this will include vegetation origin, invasiveness, hardiness, pollinator visitation, and how important the plant is known to be for pollinating insects. I'll briefly mention further considerations and discuss the review of the main plants for pollinator lists that the RHS started in 2022. I've included a couple of graphs from relevant research, but it's not too graph heavy. And I shall finish by highlighting some of the other actions, aside from planting plants specifically for pollinators, that can be taken to help UK pollinators. So I'll start with the pollinator-friendly lists. So there's a growing body of evidence documenting overall pollinator decline. So a recent assessment of UK bees and hoverflies found that about 19% were increasing, but a lot more, 42% were showing species declines. And a really important thing you can do is pick carefully the plants for your gardens and green spaces. So firstly, how do you go about picking plants for gardens, containers, and other like green spaces like community parks? So you could turn up at a garden centre and see what plants are being visited by the pollinators in the area. You can look for labelling in garden centres, or you can consult a list that has already been compiled. So pollinator-friendly plant lists exist because people want to know what they should be planting to encourage pollinators. There are many out there. So there's Be Kind, which was put together by the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. There are several like Save the Bees, Plants for Bees. Our one, but the RHS, which is Plants for Pollinators. And then there's like Bee Friendly Plant List for every season. And the Welsh Biodiversity Partnership have a really good sort of bee-friendly plant list, which includes extra icons for like garden worthiness of the plant and whether it's attractive to other groups of insects. As you can see, they're quite bee heavy, even though bees are not like the only UK pollinating insects. I believe Pollinating London Together also has a pollinator plant list. So on the whole, the lists are popular and they raise awareness of planting for pollinators. So an analysis conducted a few years ago now of 15 of these lists found that they did not overall appear to be well grounded in empirical data, and there was actually limited evidence of being anything other than based largely on personal observation and on recycling of previous lists. So someone might come across a list, think, oh, I like that, I'll base my list on that list, but maybe add a few more things in and take a couple of things out. And so Ken Thompson, so he's a researcher and author of a book called No Nettles Required, which is about wildlife gardening, described one list as looking very much like it had been put together late one Friday afternoon. Is that the next slide? Yeah. So Plants for Pollinators is the RHS one, and to start with, this was put together by an entomologist who was a dipterist. So rather than some of the other ones which are predominantly focused on bees, as included sort of plants which are attractive to a wider range of insects, just because the entomologist who put it together was a fly fancier. So RHS Plants for Pollinators is a scheme to label plants so that gardeners can readily see whether a plant is likely to be good for pollinators. We have 3 plants for pollinator lists: the British wildflowers, plants of the world, and garden plants. So the British wildflowers contains plants that are native to Britain or are archaeophytes. That's non-native plants intentionally or unintentionally introduced into Britain before about 1500. So they've been here a long time, and a lot of our pollinators would have developed associations with them. And also plants of the world, and that list is a sort of a subset of the British wildflower list and the garden plants list. And it is created to aid selection of pollinator-friendly plants from different regions of the world. So the garden plant list is pretty long. It's contains 354 taxa. However, it is divided into seasons and also growth forms. So it contains garden-worthy cultivated plants that are both native and non-native to Britain. And it contains sort of taxa listed at several taxonomic levels, so genus, hybrid genus, species, hybrid species, and cultivars. And so all the taxa below the rank listed in the list are automatically included in the list. So that means that even though it's 354 taxa, it's actually a really, really long list of plants. And as of 2022, we have been going and reviewing this. So although it's a pretty comprehensive list, as had previously been identified, there wasn't actually a database of empirical data behind it to back it up. So I'll start with one of the things that gets raised a lot, which is that it's often assumed that insects and other invertebrates that live in gardens are best supported by native plants and that non-native plants are of no benefit. So the average garden contains about 70% non-native plants and just 30% sort of British native plants. And whether or not those are intended, so a lot of those will be the ones that are considered weedy and may be removed anyway. So at the RHS, we had a 4-year study called Plants for Bugs, where we planted plants from 3 different vegetation origins, so native, near native and exotic. So to give you an example, in the native group, we had bluebells, so Hyacinthioides nonscripta, the native bluebell. And then in the near native group, we had the Spanish bluebell, so Hyacinthioides hispanica. And as the exotic sort of group, we had Norines. So they're closely related, but they're not in the same genus. And there'll be plants from, not from Europe. And so overall, looking at these sort of planting combinations, so we had them set up so they look like flower beds in the image below. And so in general, we found that a mixture of plants from different regions with a focus on growing natives, but using exotics to extend the flowering season was best to support the pollinators. So in general, a native bed did better, but it finished flowering earlier, and the beds which had the non-native plants were able to extend the flowering season, so providing support to the pollinators outside of the main window. So I mean, in general, the more flowers a garden can offer, the greater number of sort of bees and hoverflies and other pollinating insects it will attract. However, hand in hand with sort of non-native and exotic plants, a major consideration when compiling and reviewing lists is invasiveness. So the plants that we recommend for pollinators need to have no other negative environmental consequences of being planted. So both the plants imaged in the pictured are known to benefit pollinators. However, the plant on the left is Himalayan balsam, so Empathians glandulifera, and it is a non-native invasive plant. So it is a problematic weed, particularly along watercourses, where it causes habitat degradation and it outcompetes native plants. And so if Himalayan balsam is already growing in your garden, then it is not considered an offence, though it is recommended that you control or remove it. However, you must not intentionally introduce it or cause it to spread. So, I mean, they do have really nectar-rich flowers and they bloom well into autumn, and this is a favourite bee for bees, but this is not enough to outweigh its negative impacts. The plant on the right is Cotoneaster horizontalis, and that's also listed on Schedule 9 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. So it's not a plant we would want to recommend, even though it is of a lot of benefit to pollinating insects. In the UK, another consideration is hardiness. So, and whether or not the plant is available to buy. So if it needs to be cultivated in a nursery, or you need to be able to grow it from seed, and it needs to be able to tolerate a UK climate, because there's no point having a plant that's good for pollinators if it can't actually be grown in your garden. So we use a hardness minimum of H3 for plants grown as perennials in order for them to be included on our list. So the text is quite small, so I shall read it for you. So that means that it needs to be hardy in coastal / mild areas, except in hard winters, and it can sometimes be at risk from sudden or early frosts, but it may be hardy elsewhere with sort of wall shelter and a good microclimate. And it doesn't need to be completely frost hardy, but it needs to be able to survive winter with artificial protection. Another major consideration is pollinator visitation. So a plant can provide lots of nectar, but is it visited? So for us to include a plant on the plants pollinator list now, we need to have good evidence that flowers are frequently visited by UK pollinators. So you can do this. There are a number of peer-reviewed papers where you can go through and you can look at the data that's been collected on them. So you have to do extensive literature searches, but also there's the database of pollinator interactions. And we decided that you can use data from outside of the UK, provided it covered the same broad insect groups that we're interested in the UK, but it did not include like bats and hummingbirds. And also you can go out and collect FIT counts, they're flower insect timed counts, which is a scheme run by the pollinator monitoring scheme. Also, we need to know how important a given plant is for pollinating insects. So to be important, you'd want it to be sort of high in floral resources, so either nectar or pollen. And flowers obviously flower at different times of the year, and at some times of the years, resources are plentiful, so late spring to summer. However, in early spring and especially towards late autumn, there's less available. So we consider that plants that flower outside of the main flowering window would definitely ones that we'd want to include on a list. Also plants that are sort of mass flowering, so shrubs are especially important because they can offer a very large resource of multiple flowers, but also we'd want to have a large number of very different plants on the list because not all nectar is accessible to all pollinating insects. So bees can have short tongues or long tongues, and different insect orders find different flowers more easily to access. Obviously with the bees, some nectar robbing does go on, but when we are compiling a list, we wanted to include the ones that supported more different orders to make sure that those plants were included. Obviously sort of plants for specialists, so there are some bees and things which only go on some plants, so you also want to kind of weigh it and having enough for the specialists as well as having a lot of things for the more generals. So I've included a couple of pictures to show some key plants. So there we've got ivy, Heterohelix, we've got a hornet, a European hornet on it. So it's a good example of a plant that fulfills all four of these criteria we've listed. It is high in nectar, it can flower into late autumn, still providing a resource when other flowers have faded. Mature ivy plants will mass flower, and it does attract multiple insect orders. So you get honeybees, bumblebees, sawflies, social wasps, solitary bees, you'll get flies, both hoverflies and other flies. You get butterflies and moths and beetles. So here I think we've included, I've got a picture of a hornet and also a red admiral utilising ivy. There are other plants, so the goldenrod, which is another plant which satisfies all of these criteria. However, there are kind of question marks over its invasiveness, especially considering possible future changes in the UK climate. So as the UK climate changes, plants will need to be more tolerant of sort of UK weather extremes. That's hotter summer periods. Then you would want to be more drought resilient and cope with milder, wetter winters. So at the moment, many of the lists are based on what is good now for UK pollinators. However, plant lists will need to be continually reviewed because as the climate changes, different plants will be better suited to growing here and provide resources when pollinators want to access them. So we've recently conducted a review. So we started it in 2022 and we aim to publish it in 2025. So through this, we identified which plants should probably be on the list but lack supporting data. So for these, we're going to go out and collect FIT counts and collect data ourselves and make sure that they should be included on the list. We were going to look at some of them which ought to be raised to a genus level. There's some of them in particular, say like Campanula, or pick another one, Centaurea, many of the plants in that genus are very good plants for pollinating insects, at which point we'd want to list at the genus level. And there were some, not very many, where we felt that the evidence just wasn't there and it wouldn't be there, and that other plants would merit inclusion more than them. And so there were some plants that we were looking at replacing. So we'll collect additional flower insect time counts. And as you said, like as the climate changes, there may be plants that we'd want to remove because they'd be more likely to be invasive. So these are a couple of graphs just to show that in general, more plants will attract more pollinators, and just to show you from some of Nick's work that where the peaks in floral resource availability are, and that it kind of tails off, but that does obviously also match the tailing off of pollinators. But we do in the UK have a species of bumblebee that will be active for periods over winter, at which point it's important that there are some resources available to them. Across larger scales, the variation in nectar availability can kind of even out across landscapes. So part of the reason we have such a long list was that if we offered a short list and everybody planted the same thing, then it would all flower at the same time, offer the same resource to the same group of insects. But having people plant a large variety of plants means that you get a more stable provision of the resources. This is from the pretty sort of coloured graph in the centre. It's just showing sort of how the different groups of flowers in areas of Bristol, like how the different flowers contributed to the supply across a more sort of across a larger spatial scale. And so there are some here, like fuchsia offered a very, very large resource that was accessed a lot. So again, it highlights that shrubs are important, but you do obviously want a large variety of different plants, because the fuchsia, as good as it was, does not provide resources earlier on in the season. Quickly, I'll go over some other actions that can be taken for pollinators. So providing nesting sites for solitary bees, so that could be walls or leaving bare patches of ground or leaving in dead plant stems. Planting sort of plants like lamb's ear where the wool's collected by wool carder bees. Making sure that there's larval food plants available. And tolerating any damage, not spraying anything with pesticides, and avoiding planting multi-petalled cultivars of things like dahlia and clematis or rose, because when you grow these, it's not that they have extra petals, the petals have been, it's where the stamens have been replaced with petals. I believe I'm probably close to running over. So in addition, if you have a green space, anything extra that you can plant will be of benefit, and it's best to plant a large number of plants that flower across the growing season and provide nectar to multiple different insects. However, pollinators don't just require floral resources. And as a disclaimer, just because a plant isn't on a plants for pollinator list, it doesn't mean that it holds no value for pollinating insects. Right, I think I have finished.
Steph, that was absolutely fascinating. So interesting to hear about all the considerations that that are taken into account in the list. And actually it's rather helpful to hear about the myth busting, the things that what a non-expert might think was bad, whereas you think it might be rather helpful, and vice versa. So thank you so much for that. So now we're going to go on to our next speaker, who is Rhiannon Goddard. And Rhiannon is going to talk to us about the moat at the Tower of London. Rhiannon has been working in museums and heritage for over 20 years. Since 2008, she's been at the historic Royal Palaces, managing major exhibitions and public-facing events, including Royal Style in the Making, which showcased Diana, Princess of Wales's wedding dress, and also Fashion Rules at Kensington Palace. As head of public engagement projects and business management, she fulfilled the role of project director for Superbloom at the Tower of London, an ambitious project to transform the historic Tower of London moat into a flower meadow to celebrate the late Queen's Platinum Jubilee. Prior to working for historic royal palaces, Rhiannon worked at the British Museum, with the Museums, Libraries and Archives Council, and at Somerset House. She has an MA in History of Design from the V&A, and she lives in East London with her husband and a cat. So, Rhiannon, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. That's lovely. Let me have a look and see if I can share this with you. So I'm going to talk about the moat at the Tower of London. I'm not a horticulturalist or a plant expert like Stephanie. So I'm going to talk more about how we as an organisation, Historic Royal Palaces, tried to create something different in this space, which is in the centre of the city, and really thought about how we could, as an organisation, we are a charity, we don't receive any money from the government or crown, how we could actually sort of create a space that was better for pollinators and better for people within the heart of the city, whilst respecting the way that the Tower of London is as a historic monument. The moat itself at the Tower of London, there's been a moat at the Tower of London probably since it was first built by William the Conqueror in 1078. But the moat that you see today was built much later by Edward III. So it's got a long history to it and is really quite important. It was a tidal moat, so water did flow in and out of it from the Thames. But unfortunately, by the 1840s, it gained an unfortunate reputation of being London's largest cesspit and was quite a horrible space that was silted up, not very nice. And the Duke of Wellington, who was in charge of the tower at that time, thought that it was causing some sickness amongst the garrison of troops who were based at the tower, and he ordered it to be filled in. So this was done in 1845, and after the Second World War, it was nicely grassed over and mown in a neat military way, and left that in that sort of state until 2022. So it's a huge space actually, and quite grand, but visitors never really went down there. It was all about a space that was just kept as a barrier between the city and the tower. So in 2022, it was the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, and we held a couple of workshops trying to decide what to do with the space. In the previous times, we had, of course, put in other installations, the poppies, which were very well known, and in 2018, the flames. And so we wanted to do something that was on that scale, but we didn't want to copy anything that we'd done before, because that was quite a difficult act to follow. So what would we do next? So we decided to go one up from that and actually have a living display of flowers, a floral tribute to the Queen. We were inspired really by naturally occurring superblooms. So these are when dormant seeds, usually in desert locations, suddenly all burst into bloom at the same time, usually because of a recent rain event or something. These seeds can lie dormant for many years, and when they do burst into bloom, it's absolutely spectacular, and people come from all over the world to look at them. I think there's one in the top corner there is in California, which is the Californian poppy comes out. There's ones in the Atacama Desert. And although we don't have quite the same sort of massive bloom like that in Europe, we do get those sort of fields of poppies and cornflowers, which are very beautiful to look at, and also kind of inspire a nice feeling of well-being and attract pollinators. So we wanted to do something a little bit like that. The mown lawn that we had at the tower was very homogeneous. It wasn't species rich, and it wasn't attracting any wildlife. So it was a really sort of sterile place that we wanted to bring to life. And we wanted to create something that had a legacy as well. We didn't want this to be like the poppies or the flames that just came and went. We wanted to create something that was different. We wanted to experiment, and we wanted to do something that was quite bold with a historic site that hadn't been done before. It was a huge construction project to make this work. The Tower of London, as you can imagine, is full of interesting archaeology under the surface. And so what we didn't want to do was dig down into that soil and start a huge engineering project, archaeology project, digging everything up. So we decided to lay our topsoil on top of the existing moat level. We did do some digging to create some services and paths which are remaining after the super bloom event. And we brought in 10,000 tonnes of topsoil. This was engineered topsoil used from recycled sources. So this all had to be transported through the centre of London and put into the moat over quite a short period of build time. Here you see all the soil had arrived, and it was all sort of put into these mounds so that we could then spread it around the moat. We had a soil scientist working with us who made sure that the soil was right for the types of flowers that we wanted to grow. Interestingly, we chose ones that we thought were good for pollinators. We brought on Nigel Dunnett, Professor Nigel Dunnett from the University of Sheffield, who designed the seed mix that we wanted to put in place. And his sort of brief was to create something that would last the whole season, maybe stretching things out a bit. So it wasn't all native plants. There were all sorts of other things in there as well, but they were all annual seeded flowers that were sown by hand. In fact, we sowed around, we think, about 30 million seeds into the moat over the space of about 3 days, and that was done with a team of people who came from Sheffield, who worked under Nigel's supervision, and it was a huge operation because we hadn't done anything like this before. We are a historic charity who look after exhibitions. As mentioned by Cindy, most of my work is putting on exhibitions of dresses, crown jewels, that sort of thing. So this was quite different, but I learned an awful lot about how we have to prepare the ground and everything for sowing. So that was really useful. So by late April, we had completed the construction work. We wanted to put some things in there for interest for visitors whilst the flowers were growing. So in the foreground of this image, you can see what we called internally the nest, but was actually a beautiful willow sculpture done by Spencer Jenkins, who was an artist who works in willow, wanted to keep everything looking natural, but it sort of echoed the shape of the brass mount tower that you see just behind it. We had the meandering paths wandering through the space so that people could kind of get in amongst the flowers, and everything was ready for it to grow. Unfortunately, 2022 was quite an extreme year of weather, and we were faced first with very late frosts, very cold, and the lowest amount of rainfall that spring that had been recorded for about 50 years. And so the growing period that we were expecting didn't quite come off, and we had quite a lot of anxious nights and times waiting for something to appear in the moat. And in fact, by May, the East Moat grew really well. And we think that's because on the east side of the moat, it's a little bit narrower, and you have Tower Bridge coming through it. And Tower Bridge approach is all faced with brickwork, which warmed up really nicely in the sun and created a nice microclimate in that area. And so the plants grew quite well there. Whereas in this corner that you see here, which is the north west corner of the moat, that's the corner where the wind whistled round coming off the Thames, and I think it probably blew some of the seeds away, and also made the growing conditions quite difficult in that area. So in fact, we actually we had some contingency. We had some seed mats that were grown off site, and we did bring those in and lay them in some of those more bold areas to make sure that the bloom was even throughout the moat, and that was quite successful. We also put in some other features to kind of help with the kind of visitor experience in that area. So we included a slide. We had the idea of having a slide down into the moat for a bit of fun, and we contacted Clevedon in the National Trust, because we'd heard that they'd had a slide one time when they were having a staircase replaced, and lo and behold, they had that slide in store, and it fitted exactly into our drop. So it was obviously meant to be. So we got that slide out of storage and installed it. So it was nice to see another bit of recycling going on. And after we finished with it, we only kept it up for the super bloom period. We then sent it on to a place in Dorset, a children's place in Dorset, where it's got another life as well. So that was good. And we also included sound. We had a piece written specially for us called Music for Growing Flowers by a very talented Scottish composer called Erland Cooper. And we played that in part of the moat as well. And I think it probably did help the flowers grow, but it helped us relax a little bit about how much was growing at that time. So by June, we were open to the public, and we had quite a nice coverage of early spring flowers coming through. You can see some fairy toadflax there and Californian poppy. People were quite excited to see what was going on, and many people came back again and again to see how the bloom had progressed over the season. By the 10th of June, we had a lot of flowers growing, so we all sort of relaxed a little bit that it was working really well. We had those sort of daisies, the fairy toadflax I'd never seen before. It was a really beautiful flower, and we involved a large range of volunteers to come and help us in the moat. We taught them about the different plants that were growing. Nigel came down and gave them several talks and showed them the different flowers, so they were able to introduce to our visitors what was going on in the moat and what was happening where. We also had a team of garden experts who came in and did some deadheading and looking after the space as well. So by the 17th of June, everything had changed again. And you can see that different areas of the moat had different sort of species growing in it. And this was part of Nigel's plan, was with the seeds, rather than it just being one mix that was spread over the whole moat, we had 36 different mixes of seeds, and we divided the moat up into square meter plots, and we had 326 of those, and each plot had a different seed mix go into it. So we had kind of sweeping vistas of different types of planting scheme going through the space, and at times it was absolutely beautiful, and visitors really responded to that. It looked really beautiful inside the moat, and this was the first time that we had allowed visitors to come down into the moat and really explore around the space. Up until that point, for the poppies and for the flames experience, those were both designed to be viewed from the outside, so people would sort of queue up outside on the paths and look down into it. This one was about immersing yourself in the moat, in the flowers, and finding that kind of moment of peace and oasis within the heart of the city. We also created areas where people could get really good photo opportunities. So we had some sort of cutouts in our path, so you could feel like you were standing amongst the flowers. We had some nervousness that people would head off the path, but everyone was very well behaved. We didn't encourage people to collect seed heads, but we know that some people did on their way around. But fortunately, I think we had so many plants that didn't really make too much of a difference. And we also included a few sculptures towards the end as well, looking at pollinators and the types of pollinators that were coming into the moat. Over the run of the whole thing, we had over 100,000 visitors come down into the moat and have a look at what we were doing. We had a royal visit, and we also had groups of communities come and visit us as well. There's just some nice pictures of how the flowers developed over the season. By the 22nd of June, the flowering was looking really good, but then we hit a moment where we had some of the hottest weather. I think if you were in the UK at that time, you might remember that the temperature got up to nearly 41 degrees in central London, which did dry out our moat quite a lot, which was a bit of a shame. So a lot of the flowers at that point got sort of desiccated, and we were worried that after that point I think it was the first week of August, that we would have to close early. We were hoping to close at the middle of September, but fortunately, the way that Nigel had done the planting with the different plants coming through at different times, the layer underneath the early August layer came through, and we had lots of beautiful sunflowers come out towards the end of the run. So along with some other plant species as well. So although we had about 2 weeks of it looking a bit dry and brown, it did re-emerge again, which was really helpful actually, because we were in conversation with a lot of other people who were growing alongside us, community groups who'd sort of been inspired by our work, and they all experienced the same sort of thing. We also had a massive schools programme alongside the Super Bloom. So we welcomed schools from as far away as the Shetland Islands right down to the Channel Islands. We've never done such a massive project before. We sent out seeds to all of the schools that asked for it. So I think we sent out over 2,000 packets of or boxes of packets of seeds to schools, and encouraged them to create their own super blooms in their schools and to report back to us about how it was going. And they experienced the same up and downs as us. And so we all learnt together about the cold spring, the lack of rain at the beginning of the season, and the really hot spell and what that did to things. The schools also did lots of work around well-being and the importance of open space and the well-being that you can get from gardening. They also included in their work a number of fit counts. So they were looking at kind of pollinators and what types of animals and bugs and things were visiting their gardens. We had a number of partner schools within that. I think there was 46 partner schools who we worked more closely with, and they came on free visits to the tower to visit our Super Bloom and carry out fit counts in the moat, and also meet some of the people who had put the whole project together. So yes, this was the hottest day since records began, and as you can see, it very quickly dried out some of the planting that we had, and then back into sort of mid-August, and the last day on the right, the last day there, we still had a really good display of sunflowers and other things coming through, which was a relief to all of us. And I think the kind of natural sculptural look of those plants against the tower walls and the juxtaposition of the flowers against the tower walls was something that was quite unexpected and quite beautiful. And we found that people were sort of examining the tower walls and really looking at the kind of function of the moat in a different way than they had done previously. So that kind of mown lawn didn't really give it a kind of defensive feel, but you could kind of get another kind of feel from this display. During the project, we partnered quite closely with Pollinating London Together. This is a group of mainly livery companies who had got together to try and increase the biodiversity within the city, and they've now spread out beyond that as well. And with them, they sit on our advisory panel, helping us with the future of the moat, and they also introduced us to a number of funders. So we created a small extra garden as part of this project, which I haven't shown here, which was funded by the dressmaker, one of the livery companies, and it was designed around the dress that the Queen wore on her coronation. So that was like an extra bit of the Super Bloom that we did. We've carried on our relationship with them, and they're still on our moat advisory board, and we carry out our sort of annual fit count with them as well, monitoring how well the moat is doing over the years with the number of pollinators we're getting. So in the successive years after 2022 until now, we have left the moat be just to see what would happen with the seeding, how much would come through in future years. And what we've noticed is that the number of, or the variety of species that are coming through is reducing. Last year, the later part of the season was mostly dominated by a white flower called Ami, which is very much like baby's breath or cow parsley in appearance. And so it's not quite as interesting as it was in that first year, but still quite beautiful. But what we want to do in the future is think about how we can diversify the moat even more, looking at how we can introduce water back into the moat after it was filled in, also extend the flowering period, and also create some of those habitats that Stephanie was talking about to encourage pollinators to live in the moat and use that as a habitat rather than just a sort of royal feast that they can come to for that year. So we've just started a prototype area in the northwest moat where the nest was, where we have started to construct some small waterways using recycled water off the tower roofs and from the culvert that was dug underneath the moat by the Duke of Wellington's team, and also looking at creating some wetland planting and some flowering, what we're calling flowering London Common. So really thinking about the kinds of plants that were growing up in London after the Second World War, for instance, as well as more native plants and plants that will extend the flowering period. So this is in construction at the moment. And we're hoping to complete that construction by March 2025, and then monitor that for a year. And then hopefully we'll be able to use the learning from this prototype to extend that scheme out throughout the whole moat and loosen the kind of number of paths, makes things more naturalistic looking, and try and bring back some of that kind of defensive nature of the moat. So thinking about how the moat was used by people in the past. So it was used as a place for catching fish during the medieval period. It was used for growing food during the Second World War. It's been used as a parade ground. So just really bringing in some of those previous uses into the design and the way that we want to adapt the moat in the future for a kind of long-term legacy. And that's where I got to. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Rhiannon. Absolutely sort of fascinating. I mean, it's good to have the reminder of just how spectacular, you know, the floral tribute was, and good to hear that the work is, you know, that you're continuing the work.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Right. Well, we've come to the Q&A session now. We've got a little bit of time. Just one for me to start with. Steph, you've got this huge list, RHS list of pollinator-friendly plants, but if you were choosing a favourite plant species to put into a green city space, of all that huge list, what would you choose?
It is difficult because I think having a variety is really good and what's key. However, practicality wise, I'd go for something like Phacelia, where it's widely available as a green manure crop anyway. So when you get packets of it, they're quite large. It's also very beautiful. It's very attractive to a range of pollinating insects. It also makes nice cut flowers. So.
Absolutely, yes. I heard. I know you said that Himalayan balsam, you know, spreads like wildfire, but is a total nightmare. I'm afraid I've been a victim of Himalayan balsam, so I was rather pleased with you saying this is not such a good one. And I was just very interested to hear you both talk about the challenges of the planting of pollinator-friendly things. And obviously, Rhiannon, you had the weather issues. Can you tell us about any surprising planting challenges that you've experienced at firsthand, either of you?
Yeah, one we didn't really take into account was compaction of soil. So obviously we laid all that soil out and raked it over really nicely, but in some places it did get quite compacted from just the construction process. And I think that's something that can happen quite easily in your own garden as well without you really realizing it. So that was something that we hadn't really considered when we brought the soil in, that it might get a bit sort of compacted and be difficult for the little seedlings to grow, and the kind of aeration process that you have to do every year. I mean, it's probably obvious to people who are working with plants all the time, but it was quite a challenge in the moat in an area that size to make sure that we didn't end up sort of tramping across the same bit at the whole time.
Oh, yes.
How did you find that it was colonised by soil fauna? Presumably you had earthworms and springtails and things there, but did you look at what was coming in with the topsoil?
It was kind of sterilised topsoil, I think. So I don't think anything was imported with it. But we were anxious about slugs, but they didn't appear. There was some anxiousness about that. But
I don't know. I wouldn't have worried about
no,
slugs.
I don't think so. I think
but I mean, having things like earthworms there would be very important, I'd have thought, to the long-term health of the soil that would support the plants.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there's a lot down there now, a couple of years later. So the soil seems to be buzzing with life, which is really good. Obviously, we are going to move it around again to create the new landscape, but I think that's been done quite carefully. We're not importing any more new soil into the space. So,
what do you think about using sterilised soil?
Me? Well, my PhD was on soil fauna. So in sterilising soil, you're like getting rid of everything, the good things, well, the bad things, as well as the good things, which help you have a sort of a functioning, healthy ecosystem. I mean, a lot of plants rely on sort of fungi in the soil to kind of extend their root system to help with uptake of nutrients and things. So in sterilising it, you remove all of that. So yes, you're not bringing in non-native flatworms or anything else, but you might be giving yourself some different problems.
Yeah, it's a balance, I suppose.
I think because we were laying it on top of existing soil as well, and we did turn over the turf. So actually, I think although we weren't introducing anything new, everything that was there was still remaining. Yeah.
I mean, it's just interesting because it's all a balance. So rotivating the soil isn't supposed to be very good for the soil health either, and like there's so many kind of do's and don'ts, and sometimes they're contradictory.
Well, now I'm very conscious we've only got a very short amount of time, so I just wondered if we have a question from one of our listeners who says, we hear that nectar or pollen from plants resulting from selection can be less rich or interesting for insects. And Stephanie, is there anything you can tell us about this?
Do you know which plants in particular we're concerned about? Because obviously there's going to be variation within cultivars, but there are obviously some cultivars that are definitely ones to avoid because they've got extra petals instead of extra resources for pollinating insects. But there will be variation, but sometimes that will also be due to how well the plant is, like how much water it's received. And I'd imagine that the conditions that a plant is grown under would have an equally big kind of impact on how much resource they could offer.
And maybe if they don't use your list, but do select from one of these things which isn't where the list isn't particularly evidence-based, I would have thought that would be a very unfortunate thing to do.
Well, I mean, I think a lot
select from the right.
Some of the lists are based off of the plant for pollinators list. So essentially, you get into this feedback system where it was on the original plants for pollinator list, and now it's on these other lists, and then we're evaluating it. We're looking at what other lists contain these plants, and it's just like, well, that list does, but that list was based on the original list. So a lot of these lists do contain some very common plants which are very good. So lavender is always a top one, for instance.
Jolly good. So selection is good, but ideally from the right source. Right. Well, look, Stephanie, Rhiannon, thank you so much. Such interesting talks from both of you, and actually wonderful visual material as well. Thank you so much. It was both fascinating. And I would also just like to say thank you to the AIPH team, to Audrey and everybody else. And I hope you all have enjoy the rest of your days or evenings for those who are in a completely different time scale. And we look forward to seeing you at the next AIPH briefing, which I think is on the 13th of March. I think that concludes our webinar for today.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you both to both speakers and to our MC for those fascinating presentations and a wonderful discussion. To you, the audience, thank you very much for joining us here today. And for those of you who've joined us across the 2024 series, this is the final session in 2024. We'll be back in early 2025, Cindy, as you say. And in this 2025 sessions, we will feature the winning cities in the 2024 edition of the AIPH World Green City Awards. Today's webinar was indeed fascinating, and I encourage you all to recommend it to a friend or colleague and to share your thoughts from today via our LinkedIn page. Additionally, the session has been recorded and it will be available shortly on our AIPH YouTube session. To close, I'd like to again thank the sponsors of these briefing series, the Worshipful Company of Gardeners. And until next time, until next year, thank you and goodbye from me and from AIPH.